Welcome to this service from the United Methodist Church of Estes Park. It's Father's Day today in this strange time of pandemic, and we're worshiping online. My name is Dale Beck. I'm a retired minister, active in this congregation, and preaching for a couple of weeks while our congregation awaits the coming of our new pastor, the 1st of July. So on behalf of the whole congregation, I want to say we're glad that you're joining us here today. It's a strange thing to worship and to preach in an empty church. I really try to sense the people. I try to sense when you're getting interested in something and when you're losing interest, and sense when things are going well and things are going badly, and sensing that time when all of a sudden the Spirit is here among us. So today I'm kind of imagining that over there we have the Seavers sitting, and maybe a couple of rows behind that would be the Neuendorfs, and the Lemmings over here. Millie Miller would be back in the back there somewhere, and the Dohertys would be fussing around because they're probably the ushers or helping to usher. And then over there is Frank Gunter. I know Frank died a couple of years ago, but he's still very much a part of us. And Babs Mox, too, she's a part of us, and her husband, Carol, always a part of us. They're part of who we are as a church. There's a cloud of witnesses here that I need to remember. There may be a cloud of witnesses for you, too, in this church or another one, but I want to sense in this gathering that we have God's people here, and God is in the midst of us. So, Eternal Spirit, holy and compassionate God, join us together across time and space to know your love and to remember your mercies, to be joined with the great congregation whose hope is in you. Amen. Father, who art
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
Thy
Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us
Give us this day our daily bread,
and
and forgive us our trespasses,
as
as we forgive those who trespass against us.
and lead us
Lead us not into temptation,
but
but deliver us from evil.
For
For
thine
thine is the kingdom,
and
and the power,
and the
and the
glory
glory forever. Amen.
Our scripture is from the 21st chapter of the book of Genesis, beginning with verse 8. We are in the story of Abraham and Sarah, the first family of the religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You remember that they had been promised that they would have a son, and they would be the parents of a mighty nation. But they grew older and older and didn't have any children. So at last, Sarah, in a desire to please her husband and to assure an heir, had given her handmaiden Hagar to Abraham so that she could have a child through him. And he did, and she did. His name was Ishmael. A couple of years later, though, several years, Sarah became pregnant in nearly her 100th year, and she gave birth to Isaac. And this story picks up with after the birth of Isaac. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named after you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes, and then she went and sat down opposite him, a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, "Do not let me look on the death of the child." And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the boy. And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Come, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make a great nation of him." And then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. This is the word of God. Just a few verses from one of the other scriptures recommended for this week. This one from Matthew 10, verses 29 to 31. "Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground that your Father will not see. And even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows." Now I pray that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts would be acceptable to you, Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. And now to Hagar and Sarah and Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac. I confess that in the 46 years that I've been preaching, I have never touched this one. I let it come and go in the lectionary and just say, not this week. I usually look at the passage that will excite me or inspire me somehow toward a closer walk with God or a more authentic and godly life with my brothers and sisters. But I come on this one and I have a hard time. So I read it a couple of times to see what I could see. We have this account from Genesis, an origin story of the roots of the Abrahamic tradition. We celebrate Abraham and Sarah as the first in the line from which our religion is sprung. But if we're looking for these protogenitors to be the models of the best in morality and faith and courage, Abraham and Sarah disappoint. Sarah comes off looking mean and vengeful and resentful and rather hard-hearted. And Abraham is not going to be nominated for Father of the Year on this Father's Day when he agrees to banish his first son, Ishmael, with his mother. You remember, of course, that it had been Sarah's idea from the beginning to give her slave girl Hagar to Abraham so that there'd be an heir when she couldn't give him one. And now in her 100th year, she's conceived, given birth to Isaac, and she wants to get rid of Ishmael and his mother. Jealousy doesn't look good on anyone, and Abraham doesn't seem to show much backbone. But there's something that Sarah, who was the mother of the Hebrews, did not know, and that Hagar, who was the mother of Ishmael's clan, didn't know either. Abraham hadn't expected it until God spoke to him. What God knew that they did not was that they all could be okay. Life could be good for all of them. There could be good things in their future. Sarah's heart has not imagined that it can be okay for all. Isaac is always seen as one to be protected by her. Ishmael seems always the threat. Hagar's spirit has not conceived this can be, even though she was assured by God. And when her water runs out, she withdraws to a place where she'll not have to see him die and see his face. Her experience has told her that she has no power and no hope till God speaks to her again and says the future can be good for both these sons. The book of Genesis is an origin story that's sometimes painfully honest about who we are and how life is. Before Abraham sold out Hagar, he had told Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister instead of his wife. He knew that Sarah was very attractive, and Pharaoh, being Pharaoh, would want to take her, and so it was safer for him to say that she was a sister than a wife. Not a great text for Father's Day. But it's a matter of survival. In a world of imbalances of power, it seems like there's always a bigger hand to come down on you. And the smart thing to do when there's the big hand about to hit is to protect yourself. And that's the way it is. It's not Sarah's fault. It's the system they were living in that gave them this fear. And brother against brother goes all the way back to Cain and Abel. It seems like something in us that insists that there's only so much good that can go around, and whatever good you get is going to take away from someone else's good, and whatever good comes to another person is always going to take away your good. But running through this whole origin story is God's vision that life can be better than that, and that life could be good. Good for both Cain and Abel. Life could have been good, and life could be good for both sons of Abraham. Now that may seem too small an insight for a Sunday morning when we're in the midst of a pandemic that's interrupted the way we do even the most mundane things we do, that can spread by people who seem perfectly well, that's taken the lives of factory workers and heads of state and many, many elderly people, and disproportionately afflicted minorities in this country. When the employment in the country is at depression levels, and some of the businesses that have closed we know will remain closed, we find it a terribly disruptive time in life. And now we move into the fourth week of protests, first calling attention and then with nights of pushback, reminding us that it's an urgent concern that black lives matter. There have been too many deaths, unwarranted, unjust deaths of black men. And we look against this rotted evil of racial injustice that's so damaged lives and damaged our nation and our people for generations. And we ask what we can do. Can it be possible that the passage suggests to us that life can be good for all of us? It's fear, of course, that drives us, that drives people to think they may lose their jobs if someone else gets them. Fear that an opportunity for one will mean less for me or mine. Fear that if you get more, I'll get less. That fear is still with us. Sarah's fear and Hagar's fear are not so far from the fears that we all have. And their fears seem very rational to us, but they lead to the most irrational behaviors that afflict humanity in our inhumanity to our neighbors. And remember that both Sarah and Hagar were controlled by fear from the beginning of the story. It's the God we meet in this story. It's the God we meet who sees the distress of Abraham, who sees the plight of Hagar, who sees the fear of Sarah and the plight of Ishmael. It's God who sees it, and God who cares about it, and God who comes to them. All this invites us to see God in a new way. Because if we carry with us, and some do, a vision of God as the superhuman being with the accusing finger who's keeping track of sins, then remember, the image of this God is probably the image of the product of our fear, and the very opposite of what we have seen in this story and we see in Jesus. We see him not as one to be feared, but one who comes and walks into the synagogue, and his eyes first go to not to the most beautiful or the best dressed, not to the one who's in charge, but to the man with the withered arm, where he goes to heal him, who had compassion on the crowd, who reached out and touched the leper, who taught his disciples to forgive. And when they asked him to send a lightning bolt to wipe out the town that had abused him, he says, no, that's not who we are. This is a God of empathy. This is the God who is able to hear and see people in pain. This is the God of compassion, whose love isn't limited to Sarah and her son, or Hagar and hers, but both. God's love is large enough for us all. The passage invites us to think about God differently, and it also asks us to act out of a different mentality, a mentality of blessing and not fear. We can see each other not as a threat, but as a fellow journeyer in life, someone whose welfare is tied to our welfare. The virus reminds us that what happens to one of us may be carried to 2 or 3 or 4 or more of us. And so our well-being is always attached to the well-being of all the rest. Friedrich Buechner says, compassion is the sometimes fatal capacity for feeling what it's like to live inside somebody else's skin. It's the knowledge that there can never really be any peace and joy for me until there is peace and joy, finally, for you too. We are all bound together, the joy of us and the well-being of us all bound. Right after I'd been asked to preach this Sunday several weeks ago, I was talking with my daughter on the phone. She's a pastor in Billings, Montana. And she asked, so if you're preaching, what are you going to preach on? And I said, well, I looked up the passage in the lectionary, but it's an odd one. And I told her about Sarah and Hagar, and she says, oh, I preached on that once. I said, really? And she, well, at least Hagar. So we talked, and I said, you know, it just seems to me that God knows something they don't. And so began a conversation, phone calls back and forth. We've been collaborating on this sermon together, and she's preaching it this week in Billings, in her own words, her own thoughts. But she shared some of it with me, and I want to share it with you because she says it so well. She says, from the beginning of the story, if you're paying close attention, you'll notice that God made promises to both Hagar and Sarah, promises that they would both have sons who would be the firstborn of great nations. And they did. This, too, is one of the recurring themes in the unfolding story of God and us. Probably the main theme, the big reveal. From the very beginning of the story, God created a we world, a we, W-E world, a world where blessing, goodness, grace is meant for all, not just for some. The kingdom that God asks us to co-create and co-build only works when it works for all of us, because there is no such thing as I win, we lose. If we lose, I lose too. We want to live in a community where everyone can be healthy and whole. And the pandemic reminds us that we're so crazy related to each other that whatever happens to one person can so easily happen to us all. And so long as people can't afford to go to the doctor or have access to medications they need, we can't be the community we hope for. We want to live in a world where people aren't afraid, where violence doesn't happen. But as long as abuse happens in secret, or violence to others is excused or pushed under the rug, we don't live in that world. We hold dear the idea that all lives are valued and valuable, but until Black Lives Matter, both as words that we say and through the actions we take, it's not true that all lives matter. This moment we are living in now, this is a crucial moment in our lives together, in our story as people of God. Too long, we've been living with an inheritance that depended on others being cast out into the wilderness. Too long, we've been subscribing to this I win, we lose mentality, that God is rejected over and over and over. And I know that this was not completely a mess of our own making. Sarah would say that it was not a mess of her making. She didn't set up the system she was living in that measured wealth by sons. And some got everything, and some were sent to the wilderness. But that's not a good enough answer. It wasn't for Sarah, and it isn't for us. Not when God has something else in mind. Not when we're given the chance to make a different decision, to choose a different path, and to do better. The God who sees and hears our pain, who has compassion on us, calls us to listen to the voices of those who have been too long in the wilderness, and calls us to enter the pain enough to understand the wilderness and learn how it got that way and come out again. People have been talking after this pandemic about a new normal. A new normal. I guess in church they're saying no hugs. I'm not sure I like that. No passing offering plates. I could live without offering plates because most people are doing it another way anyway. Who carries cash? No hymnals. Oh, we can pass the peace like that. I like that. This could be passing the peace. But I'm looking for a different kind of new normal. A new normal that means people don't have to lose their homes and no more bankruptcies because of an illness or an accident. I'm looking for a new normal where people who work a full-time job make enough to live and have a place to live. I'm looking for a new normal where black men don't have to be wary of the police, and police don't have to be wary of them. I'm looking for a new normal in which our policing is not dangerous for anyone. A new normal where we aren't afraid of somebody else's good taking away ours. This is the new normal that I think God is calling us to. This is the God who sees and hears, who knows our fear and our pain, who is sometimes surprised by the good we do, and sometimes, I know, disappointed by it. This is the God that we worship. It's the God who radiates goodness and goodwill, radiates blessing, radiates hope and understanding and peace. For that God, by that God we are heard, and we find true life. Amen.
Make me a channel of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me bring your love. Where there is injury, your pardon, Lord. And where there's doubt, true faith in you. Make me a channel of your peace. Where there's despair in life, let me bring hope. Where there is darkness, only light. And where there's sadness, ever joy. Oh, Master, grant that I may never see so much to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love with all my soul. Make me a channel of your peace. It isn't pardoning that we are pardoned, in giving of ourselves that we receive, and in dying that we're born to eternal life.
Now I'd like to take a moment to thank Jim Eklund, who's videotaping this service and will put it together for us. And my daughter Sarah, who collaborated with me over several weeks to share her thoughts on this passage. And I want to thank Mike Elgin, who helps to organize our website, and Matthew Perry, whose organ music warmed us today. I want to thank folks in the church whose ongoing financial support helps us through this pandemic and this time of worship online. That support has been a blessing. If you'd like to contribute to the work of the church, you can do that on our webpage. epumc.org. And there's a place to donate, marked Donate Here, online. I want to thank the teams of members who over the past weeks have ripped out carpet and painted walls and installed appliances and done so many things, painting, to make the home, our parsonage, nice for our new pastor, Ann Lance, and her wife, Agnes, as they come to us in 2 weeks. We appreciate the great help that they've been. Now, God of us all, your love never ceases. Look upon your servants, look upon us with your love and grace. Radiate in us and to us that great love, mercy, peace that you have to give. Amen.